What happens when a government tells its citizens to submit their bodies to a medical procedure for the sake of the public good? In the 18th century, smallpox was one of the deadliest diseases in the Atlantic world. It scarred faces, shattered families, and killed without mercy. But it also forced Americans, long before the Constitution was ratified, to confront a fundamental question. What does liberty mean in the face of contagion? Today I'm joined by historian Andrew Wehrman to discuss his book, Contagion of Liberty, which explores how smallpox and the practice of inoculation became flashpoints in the early republic. Communities imposed quarantines, towns debated compulsory inoculation, legislatures wrestled with whether protecting public health justified restricting individual freedom. Sound familiar? The tensions we saw during COVID-19 over vaccines, mandates, masks, business closures weren't born in 2020. They were present at the founding. Early Americans argued passionately over bodily autonomy, state authority, economic disruption, and the balance between personal liberty and collective safety. In this conversation, we dig into how the founding generation navigated those tensions and what their struggles reveal over our own debates today. Because the conflict between freedom and public health isn't new. It's American. I'm Jason Herbert, and this is A Reckoning. My name is Jason Herbert. I'm a Southerner who lives in the West. I'm a historian, an outdoorsman, and a movie buff. I like finding new answers to old questions, and this is A Reckoning. All right, my first question, Andy, is: are you caffeinated already?
Am I caffeinated? Yes. Had some this morning. So, am I as caffeinated as you might be on your Cuban coffees that I know you like, that kind of thing? No, but
Nobody's
I'm doing all right.
caffeinated as I am when I've got Cuban coffee. In fact,
it's 11 a.m. here. It's only 9 where you are, so I'm going.
Yeah, well, the bad thing was I started with Cuban coffee and then I switched to zero sugar Mountain Dew, which is not a sponsor of the show, but could be if they wanted to be. And now I feel like my heart's racing and I won't live it to be to see America 275 at this point in time. But that's fine. Dude, I am excited to talk to you about your work and you. This is our first conversation like we've ever had personally. And these are kind of
when Twitter was Twitter, we did had some things.
But like full on actually talking.
I know.
And this is actually one of my favorite things about this pod is like gives me an excuse to finally reach out and have these real conversations that we might ordinarily have if I were in the Eastern time zone of Michigan or we were in your old haunts of Kansas City or something like that. And that's fun. And this book is fun. It's relevant. The work that you're doing, I think, is super important, especially in regards to our contemporary time, coming out of COVID, going into America 250. I started looking, I was like, God, man, this thing is so freaking important considering what we've got. So, I guess let's start there, dude, and just kind of jump into it. Do you want to introduce yourself and tell us what it is you're doing here?
What I'm doing here.
Well, what are you here for, Andy?
Well, you asked me, and I said okay. No, so I'm Andrew Wehrman, Andy to friends. I'm a professor at Central Michigan University. I study and research early American history, the American Revolution, and history of medicine and disease, and where those paths come together. Yeah, I got my PhD a while ago now. Feels like it anyway. At Northwestern University, student of Tim Breen there. And yeah, when I started this dissertation, we can go on the road and talk about it. I didn't know this would be relevant and a touchstone on recent issues. And in fact, I sort of hoped it wouldn't. I didn't want anybody to have an epidemic and experience quarantine in their own lives. So, it was a little bit of an esoteric topic when I got going, but it has become relevant and interesting and important over time. So I'm happy to talk about it more.
Yeah, I was, looking at the book and reading through it. Original publication was 22. Now it's coming back out in paperback, which tells me there's a thirst for this thing. The press is pushing it real hard. And yeah, it's one of those things where it's like, oh my gosh, you wrote this thing and you were researching it for years before COVID-19 hit. And it just kind of comes out and puts a lot of these debates over vaccinations, over masking, over the social order, or debates about Americanness and the role of the state in dictating what we should do with our own bodies into a historical context. And I thought that was really, really important. And as we see, I think it's going to remain important for a long time.
Let's talk about how long this thing took to write.
Yeah, well, actually, I do want to do that because I do want to actually get into the production of this book, which is fascinating. Like, Andy, where did the idea germinate from to write this book on smallpox and the American Revolution?
Oh, through struggle, Jason. At graduate school at Northwestern, in a PhD program, there are a few, ticking clocks that come along, and you have the first couple of years where you're taking classes, but in the back of your mind, you're going to have to work on this dissertation. You're going to have to come up with an original topic. I'm interested in the American Revolution, one of the most studied things, maybe the most studied thing in American history. So it's daunting to try to think of something original to do with it. I didn't come into graduate school as a medical historian. I was interested in sort of popular politics. And so my favorite book among them anyway, the one I kind of really wanted to follow after was Robert Gross's The Minutemen and Their World. I like these kind of town studies. I wanted to know how a community resists. How does the preacher in the church contribute? How does the blacksmith get riled up? How do the soldiers, come into battle? And he does all those things. And so I started looking for different communities that maybe hadn't been studied much before. And I was worried that I wasn't going to come up with something. But I looked at the second and third largest cities in Massachusetts after Boston. Boston, everybody talks about,
sure.
And were Salem and Marblehead, Massachusetts, and they're not much in histories of the American Revolution. They're what happens there doesn't get talked about much, and so I was kind of looking at a community study, maybe a twin town study of these kinds of places. But when you start looking at what Salem and Marblehead were doing in the few years before the Revolution, they're not talking about the Tea Party. They're not talking about the Stamp Act. They don't really participate in that stuff. They're not far from Boston, only about 15 miles away, these two sort of twin port cities. But they're all consumed with smallpox. Smallpox breaking out in 1773, who's getting affected, who's dying, what they're going to do about it. Are they going to build an inoculation hospital? Who's going to pay for it? How's it going to work? And I discovered the story, right? So that there were these conversations and debates happening at the same time as what we know of as the events leading up to the Revolution, that were about health and healthcare and protecting from disease. So I sort of thought, well, in every modern political campaign, people talk about healthcare and disease. It's political, and somehow over time, in the way history works, the politics of medicine sort of got left behind in this story. But it was certainly a reason why Americans were getting really angry and defensive, and were thinking about what good government should do. And I think that the language and the anger and the hostility coming out around smallpox really propelled and agitated people in ways that made them open to wanting a new government to fight for things that that they were much more tied together than I had experienced before. And then once you get that thread as a historian, once you start unraveling it and say, oh, so it's happening in these two towns, that's where I look first. Is it happening in other places? And you find, yeah, it is. The debate's happening really across the colonies in big cities, small towns, how they're dealing with this growing epidemic of smallpox.
Yeah, here's the thing. Do I dare say I love reading about smallpox? I don't. I could definitely say that about. I can definitely say that about yellow fever and malaria because we'll get into McNeil here in a little bit. But the comparisons. I'm not even going to try to hide the comparisons between smallpox and say COVID-19 or even polio or Spanish flu because I just think they're apt. But I think there's a real tendency on the part of contemporary Americans, even as we talk about COVID, as people say, oh, before COVID, after we talk about this in terms we say the word COVID and refer to it as a very specific number of years. And I think almost, Andy, there's this almost this tendency for people to forget the lack of knowledge that happened in the moment with COVID. It's like, oh, we had to wear a mask and blah, blah, blah. Nobody knew anything at the time. There was this real chaotic period. And I think that that's kind of what we're also seeing in the moment in your book is wait, there's this, everybody's trying to figure out what do we do and how do we respond to this? And there's all of these different religious and political responses, both to and or both for and against, inoculation to this thing. And boy, the mirrors to the contemporary age are just right there.
How do you think I felt, Jason? So, COVID breaks out.
Yeah.
I'm needing to publish my book. It's taken a long time. I've expanded it in a lot of ways. I've added chapters, doing things, and I need tenure, and I need to make sure that this thing is ready to go. And things start shutting down. I got a book contract sort of right as in March 2020, right as things were heating up, and so I'm at home, with all of this knowledge about debates over quarantine and contagion and the founders' role and what they thought of public health laws and shutdowns and things, and I'm seeing these protests emerge when here in Michigan the governor shuts down various things, schools and churches and even businesses for a while. And there are these protests in Lansing where people are carrying Betsy Ross flags and "Don't Tread on Me" flags to the Capitol, as if to say this is against that public health is somehow against what the founders intended. And I'm just like, I got to get this book done. I got to get this draft written. So it, even though the research and most of the bulk of the writing had happened long before, the final draft of it in some ways was influenced by the epidemic. I think it gave it a little bit of an edge to the writing. It's like, okay, now we're relevant. This wasn't just an interesting story about the revolution. It's something that people need to know about their own history and background, and that it was near universally accepted that the government should step in and act during epidemics. That this is a duty of the government to protect the people to the best of their extent from disease, and that includes quarantines and shutdowns and providing inoculation to the public. And a lot of that was really hashed out and decided during the revolution itself, because the American Revolution was fought during a smallpox epidemic. So all of these things were coming together. Yeah.
How does that feel for you as a historian when you see people go out and say, oh, vaccinations are un-America, they've got their "Don't Tread on Me" flags, or I often see the 1776 shirts, so I'm like, oh my, you must love American history too. And then there's this utter corruption of history, because frankly, by people who haven't done the work. And I often feel, Andy, and this is I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I often feels like, wait, there's cosplay patriotism by people who frankly have not done the reading, who haven't seen this kind of stuff. I mean, is there frustration on your part going, wait a second, I know this to be absolutely opposite as far as what actually happened. Do you feel like the guy in the bar going, well, actually, I mean, how does that work for you?
I was beyond that. I was so angry. I wasn't to an unhealthy extent, I think, as the COVID was happening, and especially that kind of cosplay patriotism. But on the one hand, yeah, you don't know what you're talking about, right? The Gadsden flag, right? The "Don't tread on me" snake. I had information. It's in my book. This is a small paragraph. There's a lot of stuff in the book, easy to miss. But Christopher Gadsden in South Carolina was a smallpox commissioner. It was his job to quarantine people, to keep track of how many people were sick, to isolate the sick, to manage their public health. And the idea that what he meant by his flag was that the government should never do anything, should never force people to do things, is just not true. He was against arbitrary government, was against a distant government that didn't understand the people. But locally, he thought that the government's job is to help people, is to stop disease. Now, he wasn't exactly a great guy. He was one of the biggest slave traders in South Carolina. But still, in terms of what government should do, it was a duty to protect the public in times of epidemic. So, yeah, I was angry about that. But the other sort of edge was, okay, if we're going to be somehow rooting our argument and our anger in the founding, well, that gives me a window as a historian to try to communicate with some of these folks. I'm not going to be able to necessarily communicate on a scientific background about vaccinations or the statistical effectiveness of various masks or quarantines, but I can talk about the history of the politics of it, and that certainly the founders of the country accepted quarantines and encouraged them. And not just the leaders, the people themselves were calling for these things, demanding that their governments do more. So it does provide a little opening to talk to some people. Obviously, some don't want to hear it, but I think it can be good to participate in those conversations.
Well, before we jump too much into these debates around smallpox, the politics, the religious aspects, and all of these different things, Andy, maybe the best thing for us to do is not take smallpox for granted. I think most of the listeners here are familiar with what smallpox maybe was, or know that it was a big deal, a lot of people. But can we actually talk about what smallpox was and is as a disease, how it gets transmitted, and then what it does, how quickly it decimates populations? Can we talk a little bit actually about what smallpox is?
Let's go back and
let's
make sure we're on the same path, because smallpox was and is unique among diseases that mankind has faced. One, it's been eradicated, was the first disease, only one of two. The other one's rinderpest, which doesn't really affect us all that much. But that mankind actually eradicated this thing. And so I think that there's I get some optimism from that. And it took cooperation across nations to do it, the USSR and the United States. Really interesting story of 20th century health, how it was actually eradicated. But prior to that, it's the deadliest disease in the history of mankind. It is a virus, variola virus, that doesn't have any animal vector. It's why we're able to eradicate it, because we don't have to kill all the bats that carry it or all the rats or mice. It only affects humans. It should be called human pox. There are other pox diseases like cowpox and camel pox and horse pox. This is the one that affects that evolved to affect humans and live in us. And there are people that are smarter than I am about this kind of stuff that think smallpox has very ancient origins going back thousands of years, but it seems pretty evident that around the time of European colonization in the Americas, that it had evolved to be more virulent, a stronger strain than it had been before. And it's smallpox really that is the leading sword of colonization that the Spanish and Portuguese and English carry, and like you said, decimates and worse native populations, because there was no immunity to European infectious diseases, but smallpox being just the worst among them, the highest mortality rate. Among native populations, especially early contact, smallpox had a fatality rate 50%, sometimes higher than that. And a lot of that cause was because native people hadn't experienced that kind of infectious disease. One, their bodies weren't ready for it, but two, also their sort of cultures and politics weren't there for it. So when somebody gets sick, the community rallies around them, visits them, cares for them, which you want to isolate the sick when you're in smallpox. And so part of it is that, right, of why the mortality rate was so high. And it took a while for native populations to sort of create structures around how you deal with infectious disease in different ways. But even among European communities, white populations in the colonies, case fatality rates 15, 20%, much deadlier than COVID or really any other disease that was circulating at the time.
Yeah, I think one of the things that when I used to teach, I used to talk about this a lot, was that, when smallpox hits either native communities or even, say, settler communities or black communities, it doesn't just wipe out people, right? It wipes out shamans. It wipes out warriors or defenders of a town. It wipes out the hunters. It wipes out the clan matrons. So it's not just killing people. It's killing fundamental blocks of a community. Robbie Etheridge talks a lot about this idea in her own work, in the Native South, the Mississippian Shadow Zone, how like these entire fundamental aspects of, say, a Choctaw town, or, you can compare this to places in Massachusetts. It's not just people die. Roles die, positions die, and then the fundamental nature of, say, a civilization just completely breaks down to like it's atomic levels. It destabilizes.
It's elders, it's children. With smallpox, though, it's anybody. It's not just the extremes in age, and so it's yeah.
And then Andy, the transmission, right? Like, you don't have to be showing signs of smallpox to give someone smallpox, correct?
It's a little different. It's certainly different than COVID. There's no asymptomatic smallpox. If you get it, it, and you carry it, and it's visible. That's part of the reason it's able to be eradicated, but also so feared. But there is a period, I think this is what you're talking about, where you feel sick. You have a fever, a headache, a backache. You're infectious then. Before the actual pox, those pus-filled pustules that appear on your face and hands come out. So yeah, it's possible to you're most infectious when you've got the fever and those pox start coming out. But yeah, you can spread it otherwise. It's relatively easy disease to quarantine by modern standards. You can isolate people from them. It isn't as infectious as like a measles or an influenza. If you're 10, 20 feet away from somebody in a room, they're probably not going to catch it. It's through water droplet transmission, not completely aerosol. But in a time where people don't understand germ theory, it wasn't just native people that didn't, right? Europeans don't really understand how smallpox spread either. It's terrible in terms of its impact. So quarantine laws start coming into effect in the early 1600s in most colonies. They're inspecting ships when they come into port, checking on the sailors. Do any of them feel sick? If so, they'll be isolated. The other thing to kind of mention, especially in colonial American cities, Boston and Philadelphia and New York. Smallpox isn't endemic in colonial America. It isn't ever present. It isn't a childhood disease like measles. It's not always around. It's epidemic. They do everything they can to inspect ships arriving in port. If they know that there's an outbreak in Liverpool and they've got a ship arriving from Liverpool, they're really going to isolate those sailors and all the stuff on board. So for decades at a time, nobody in a city or town would have smallpox. If you're in a rural part of, which most colonial Americans were, Massachusetts or Virginia, you could go your whole life without getting smallpox. It wasn't just everywhere, but when it broke out of these quarantines, it was really scary and really dangerous because most of the population didn't have any immunity from it.
All right. Well, this kind of gets into a lot of the debates here, and I want to lay out this other concept that's throughout the book, right? Not only quarantine, but this idea of inoculation. And I, even myself, at times, Andy, get confused between the differences between, say, inoculation and vaccination. Can we talk a little bit about maybe the differences between the two?
No, it has to be talked about all the time, and we kind of use in modern language, we use them kind of interchangeably.
Yeah.
You can get inoculated for COVID, you can get vaccinated for COVID, and they mean the same thing. But they didn't in the past. Inoculation is like a horticulture term. You can inoculate a plant, right? Mm-hmm. You put another stem on a tree or whatever. That's kind of where it comes from. But inoculation is the general broad term, and it was the first mitigation against smallpox, and Europeans were the last to know about it. They always like to think that they come up with everything, but they're the last to know about this. The British and colonial Americans were especially late to the game because where smallpox was more common, especially in places where it was endemic, people realized that if you caught smallpox when you were a kid, you'd get lifetime immunity from it after that, so you'd become immune to it. So it was sometimes better to expose yourself purposely as a kid to it. Over time, they realized, okay, if you take a little bit of the smallpox matter, a little bit of pus, you make an incision in the skin. They do it in different places in different cultures, and put some of it in there, patch it up on the arm. If you take smallpox via your skin, it tends to give you a milder case of the disease than if you breathe it in through your lungs. That's how smallpox naturally comes. You breathe it in. But if you inoculate somebody, if you make a cut, put it on the skin, you have a much lighter case of smallpox. The mortality drops way down. And it was highly survivable. And they're doing this in China 1,000 years ago. They're doing it in the Middle East somewhere around the same time. The Arab Muslim world in Turkey and other places are doing it. And they're doing it in Africa and in African villages. And there are historians really trying to isolate it. I didn't mention India when I talk. That somebody will email me and say they were doing it in India before they were doing it in China, right? But the point for my book is British colonial Americans, British people, colonial Americans learned about this really late. The famous story in Boston is that Cotton Mather, the reverend of the First Church of Boston, famous for his advocacy for prosecuting witches during the Salem witch trials, his congregation gives him a slave as a gift, if you can believe it. Gives him an enslaved black man that Mather names Onesimus after a slave in the Bible. And to Mather's credit, he actually talks to this guy, and it's clear that Onesimus must have been really smart and really brave to even share his story with his enslaver. And Mather, to his credit, listened. And Mather asks Onesimus, "Have you ever had smallpox before?" And Onesimus says, "Well, yes and no." And describes the process of inoculation that he had in his village. He had a sort of mild case, didn't take it on naturally, but now he has immunity to it. Mather thought that was really interesting, sort of filed it away in his brain. And later on, when the Royal Society, about a decade later in England, has first sort of become aware of inoculation happening in Constantinople in Turkey, Mather writes in and he said, I knew about this before, and I learned about it from my African slave named Onesimus. Mather tries to convince people in Boston during the next outbreak of smallpox that they should use this method. It's one of the most interesting things to teach and things in colonial American history is the Boston epidemic of 1721, because you've got this kind of religious zealot saying we should use this African technique, that everybody in Boston should do it. And the scientific community in Boston is saying, wait. We can't just do this. We need some experimentation, which maybe makes some sense. We need to test it. But then there's also all these racist arguments, right? Why should we get our science from a slave? Why should we take African knowledge? Maybe this guy is actually trying to trick us into poisoning ourselves. Maybe that's what it is. And then there's this religious test. It's God decides who gets sick, right? And God decides who gets well. So purposely giving somebody a disease seems like you're doing God's work. And so there are other ministers in Boston saying, no, we shouldn't do this. That's playing God. That's where Mather was on his home court, right? He is a very learned minister, and he shuts down that argument and says, no, this is a gift from God, right? And to deny inoculation is to be denying God's gift. And he says, look, God put our Savior in a tiny manger when he was born. Isn't it just like God to give a gift to the lowliest person in a society first, right? Mather's making these cool arguments, and it's starting to win a few people over. One doctor in Boston named Zabdiel Boylston decides to do it. He inoculates about 300 people. Meanwhile, about 5,000 people in Boston are getting sick in the natural way. And Bostonians, Mather and others, are keeping track. They're counting who's sick, who's dying. They're comparing those numbers to the people Boylston's inoculating. After the epidemic ends, they look at those numbers, and Boylston's success rate is much higher than the natural disease itself. Inoculation killed about 2% of Boylston's patients, which is not nothing, but the natural disease took something like 15%. And as the decades go on, past 1721, inoculators get better at it. Boston becomes a real site of promoting inoculation during future years. They do larger and larger mass inoculations of the public. Colonial Americans start getting really excited about it. And that's really where my book takes off, is this growing demand for public inoculations that's coming about at the same time as the American Revolution is breaking out.
All right. Well, let's
talk. Inoculation, vaccination, we didn't do the difference.
Go for it. Yeah, go for it.
So quicker. So inoculation is sort of a precursor to vaccination. Vaccination is discovered and publicized by Edward Jenner after the Revolution. He's a British country doctor in 1796. And he sees that there's another pox disease, cowpox, that cows get, that humans can't get. We don't get really sick from it. But he discovered that if you inoculate someone with cowpox, you do the same technique as inoculation, but you use a little bit of the pus from a cow and put that in a skin, that it's much safer yet, lower mortality. Humans don't really carry cowpox. We can't spread it to each other, so we're not infectious. That's a big problem with inoculation, because you're having a mild case of smallpox and you have to be isolated for like a month from your family, from your coworkers, from your church, and in order to recover and not spread smallpox to everybody else. But with cowpox vaccination, you could get vaccinated and go back to work that day. You could vaccinate one person in your household who was risky and not everybody else, and they wouldn't spread the disease. So vaccination was an improvement on that same technique that was much safer. But that comes after the revolution.
All right. Well, so much of the revolution, and not all of it, is about personal liberties versus the state and what the state is telling us what to do. So much of our own current debate, and really maybe one of the fundamental aspects of being American has always been the personal liberties versus what the state tells you what you can and cannot do. So what I'm interested in here, Andy, is when does the state or maybe even the local municipality start saying, hey, inoculation is a thing we want for you to do or that you should do? And when does this start to get, when does the pushback, when you get all these people dying around you and people saying, no, I want to take my chances. I don't believe in this or whatever. I guess MAG, to begin with, when does the pushback start to happen, connecting, say, personal and the bodily autonomy as this exorcism of of political rights?
I thought I'd see a lot more resistance to inoculation than I did when I started the book. So there was this controversy in 1721 in Boston that people were refusing to inoculate. Cotton Mather gets a bomb thrown in his front window. It doesn't explode, but there's violence over people who are willing to inoculate because people are thinking that's going to start a broader epidemic. But over time, people are won over as there are more inoculation efforts, 1730s, 40s, 50s. It becomes the hot thing, right? Smallpox was so dangerous and so deadly, and in a time where there's very few cures for anything, that medicine at the time of the revolution isn't all that helpful, except in this one way, that it will give you immunity to the most dangerous disease facing mankind. So there was a demand for it. It's hard to understate. So when there was an epidemic of smallpox in a community, people started asking, when can we get inoculated? When can we do it? Boston in 1764, so the year before the Stamp Act, in 1764, has a general inoculation of the whole town. Inoculation as a process is expensive, right? Doctors charge a lot for it. You have to take a month off of work because you have to be quarantined. And so only really rich people can do that. An average working class guy not only can't pay the £5 that it might cost, especially for himself, let alone his kids, his family. It's going to cost more than an average sailor makes in a year to inoculate his family. But two, he can't stop working for a month while it goes on. And so Boston realized, city officials, that the way to do it is you have to shut down all commerce in the town. You have to completely close a city off and say, we're going to all inoculate at once. So nobody's really working. And that means that the poor and the rich can inoculate together. Boston paid for doctors, reimbursed doctors who inoculated poor patients. But they're also doing things like paying bakers to make bread so people don't go hungry during this month or two operation. It was an extensive thing and incredibly popular. There are not arguments in 64 or the next general inoculation in 1776 where people are saying, I don't want this. This is not something the government should be doing. This violates any liberty. Now, they're not forced to do it. There are people who, for whatever reason, decide to leave Boston before the inoculation starts. They announce it a few days in advance. If you don't want to do this, you can leave town, but the community is gonna inoculate together. and massively popular, and other communities are wanting it. There's an episode in my book, actually the first thing that I wrote, which was the next town over from Boston, Marblehead, when epidemic started spreading there in 1773. Their solution was, we're going to build a private hospital, and people can go there and get inoculated. We're going to build it on an island off the coast of the city so it won't infect the town. And people were excited. We'll bring in an inoculator. We'll start inoculating people on this island hospital. But over time, the regular people in Marblehead realized they're never going to be able to afford to get inoculated. And while the rich people in their community and nearby communities are going off to this fancy hospital, the rest of them are still getting sick and dying. And it's not working for them. And in this explosive episode that happens about a month after the Boston Tea Party, a group of people from Marblehead burn this brand new state-of-the-art hospital to the ground in January 1774. And it's a similar cause as the revolution itself. This is a nuisance, just like the tea is a nuisance. It's this kind of luxury good that we don't need. We can do without it. And other historians, when they had looked, and there hadn't been many who had looked at this episode in Massachusetts' second largest city, the burning of this hospital. I should say there weren't any patients in it at the time. It was between groups of inoculees, so they weren't monsters exactly. They didn't hurt anybody, but they burned it to the ground. And other historians had said, well, they did this because they were superstitious. They were anti-vaxxers before vaccination was invented. They didn't understand the science. They were behind the times. And it wasn't true at all. 2 years later, when smallpox comes again, in 1777, the town, rather than building a private hospital, votes to just go door to door, to send doctors door to door to every household in the city and inoculate everyone who wants it for free. And there's no protest over that. Nobody's attacking these doctors. They're welcoming them into their community, and it's a mass inoculation, big level, and that's a revolution in some of these communities where you see mass inoculations. Later on, of course, and I talk about it a couple chapters down in the book, George Washington sort of succumbs to this pressure that's building, this demand that ordinary Americans are putting on their government. No, you can't just inoculate the wealthy. You have to provide it to everyone, even if it's going to cost a lot of money, even if it's going to shut down trade for a while. It's your duty to protect us from disease. And Washington decides to inoculate the Continental Army as well. And again, you don't see soldiers refusing it at all. I thought I'd find somebody, but there's no evidence of any soldier having any sort of argument against it. They all want it. This is expensive. They can't get it on their own in their communities. Their wives are writing letters saying, you better not come home unless you've been inoculated. They're demanding it. And so that's a difference. That idea of that somehow inoculation or vaccination is somehow a violation of personal liberty, that comes about later. That's not during this period. That comes in the 19th century when you start getting compulsory vaccinations of school kids. That argument starts coming up. But in this period, inoculation is new and hot, and people want it, and it's life-saving, even if it is still a little bit dangerous.
All right. Well, I want to ask you here, because people love to talk about the war itself. And I had never really started to think, Andy, about the disease history of the war until I read Mosquito Empires. And J.R. McNeil's book is still probably my second favorite book I've ever read in my life. The dude is hilarious. I've never read a history book that makes me laugh before I read his work, and it's so dry and funny. But of course, that's talking about yellow fever and malaria, largely in the southern colonies. Can we talk about Washington's decision on a military level strategically? Like, were the British doing the same thing? Were they inoculating, or was this something that Washington did on his own? And what effect does this have on the war itself, his ability to fight another day?
Yeah, McNeil's book is great, and it does do that. It is a little bit funny. I don't know. My book isn't funny. I kind of wish it was. Maybe my next book I'll have some humor in it. My undergrad advisor at Arkansas is Elliot West.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
Read
Continental Army.
Elliot West. He's funny in his writing. It's very kind of folksy, and anyway, so I admire that as well. But I mean, Mosquito Empire talks about how the British Army in the South was really hammered by malaria and yellow fever, and in part that's because they were not that affected by smallpox. Smallpox was endemic from most of the communities in Great Britain where the soldiers were coming from. So most of them had it as children. They did not have the 90%, 95% of the Continental Army had never had smallpox before. And it's probably a similar number, 80% or something like that, of British soldiers were immune to smallpox. So they did inoculate. General Howe would poll his soldiers and say, has anybody not had smallpox before? And the ones that raise their hands, they go off and get inoculated. So it wasn't as big a deal. It was really small numbers. Washington had to inoculate thousands at a time, where the British would just kind of do it piecemeal. American soldiers, especially like the militia guys who were from the Carolinas, from Virginia, as well as the members of the Continental Army who were from those places, carried more immunity to the southern diseases, to the yellow fever and malaria. They could get sick too, but they didn't succumb to it as much as the British Army did. So, the American Revolution in the South there's a historian who calls it a trigonal war. It's a war between the British Army, the Continental Army, and the enslaved people who are trying to figure out freedom for themselves, and kind of going back and forth and figuring out where that's going to be. But it's more than that. There's also the microbes who are involved and who gets affected. So smallpox affects the Americans. Yellow fever, malaria goes after the British people. Enslaved people are kind of getting sick, especially from smallpox, from both of it all around. It's just chaotic. I mean, you get that from Mosquito Empires, how deadly and dangerous the war in the South was. Washington's decision to inoculate, it's a big deal. It's a constant worry early in the war. Smallpox and its outbreak is part of what dooms the Canadian campaign early on, and why the United States doesn't take over Montreal and Quebec. It's because all these soldiers are dying from smallpox. But after Washington does inoculate the Continental Army in 1777, he hardly has to talk about smallpox after that. By 1778, the Continental Army is good. Outbreaks in New England are stifled. It's not happening anymore. So Washington focuses his campaign, the inoculation centers that he establishes, in Valley Forge, in New Jersey, in New England. That's where the disease was. He does not call on the governor of South Carolina or North Carolina or Georgia to build inoculation hospitals. So, so smallpox does affect the South. The soldiers of the Continental Army don't get it; they're pretty immune to it. But it spreads, especially among enslaved people in the South, and then some Native communities. It spreads in the South. That it's still there, and that's where it's affecting. Southern plantation owners are largely not inoculating their slaves, for similar reasons that we talked about before. It's expensive, and it will take them a month off of work if you're going to inoculate your slaves. So most of them don't. They inoculate their white families, sometimes the sort of household slaves who are close to them, but people working in the fields, they're largely left without inoculation, left susceptible to the disease. So there's vast numbers of enslaved and fugitive Black people in the South who succumb to smallpox at the same time. So it's a chaotic disease environment. You've got some soldiers who are immune to some diseases. You've got some people who are immune to some. The British are dying from yellow fever and malaria. That gives some advantage to Southern American patriots, which is sort of McNeil's argument, which is true. Cornwallis's troops are really suffering from yellow fever and malaria, and as part of the reason he's trying to go north to get away from those mosquitoes when he ultimately surrenders.
Well, all right. I want to move past the war because clearly George Washington wins every single battle. Wait a second, he doesn't. And clearly,
there's one thing right. The inoculation decision was great.
Yeah, great. Yeah, he does a lot of great stuff. I always love the argument of Washington. He's not good. He's his best. He's really good at retreating. And there's all these great things. My great friend Craig Bruce Smith talks a lot about Washington, obviously. But let's move past the war because the colonies win the war. Freedom and justice for everyone, obviously.
USA.
Everyone's happy, obviously. What happens to this idea, Andy, of public health after the war? Does it stay national? Does it go back to being local? Like, is there a public health afterwards? How do you start to mandate health now that we have a new nation?
Yeah, I mean, they don't really use that term public health yet. Right. I don't know when that quite comes about. But the inoculation and this demand for it to defeating smallpox isn't just a wartime thing. Washington does it for the Continental Army, but all these other communities are inoculating. They're managing general inoculations like Boston does. Some of them do kind of public-private things where they say, if you're a doctor and you're doing private inoculations, that a quarter of your patients need to be poor patients. You need to have free inoculations. So if you're charging some, you need to not charge others. They come up with all these kind of systems in different communities for how to inoculate and protect people from smallpox. So it's still something that they're doing. But you're right that it's not something that the federal government does. It's done at a very local level. News is traveling really slowly. So an outbreak of disease in Pennsylvania takes a long time even to reach Philadelphia, let alone for somebody in the federal government to kind of come out and respond to it or fund it. So it's all done locally, local level, county level. States are making new laws about quarantines, when inoculation can be used, how it's used. Just during the war, there's a number of new laws that are coming about, opening up hospitals. I'll give you an example. So Rhode Island passes a law during the Revolution banning private inoculation hospitals and instead opening public ones. So they take control of the system to try to make sure that everyone, rich or poor, can get inoculated. Other towns do different sorts of things. In the 1790s, so Washington's administration, there are mass inoculation efforts all across the United States in individual communities. So Boston has another one. There are general inoculations in Richmond, Virginia, in Norfolk, Virginia, in Charleston. So it's not just North versus South. They're doing it in all of these places. Now, when the Constitution's written, Philadelphia in 1787, there's no threat then. It's not in an epidemic time from smallpox that was largely defeated during the Revolution. It's not on the minds of the drafters of the Constitution. So other than the phrase providing for the general welfare in the preamble, there's nothing really in the Constitution itself about medicine or health, and that it's a responsibility of the government. That changes a little bit later in the early 1790s, Washington's administration, there were debates over something called the Quarantine Act, and they're trying to figure out, does the president have any role over quarantines? And it was thought that if local communities quarantine too much, that it might affect the national commerce, it might affect the economy. But there was also worry that the president might be too lax, might not call for quarantines when it was needed. Some states were really proud of how well they quarantined. Others were a little bit more open. So it didn't really get settled. It was still really up to a local issue. And in those, the Quarantine Act just said that the federal government would aid the states in their quarantine efforts. So it's really fluid early on, but there's a general understanding that government at any level is going to do its utmost to stop disease. It was really just about how it could be done most effectively, and that was usually at the local level.
Can I ask you, like, you know all of this stuff, and again, we talked a little bit about this earlier about the forgetfulness of the populace, and I don't think this is an innately American thing to do. We look back and go, gosh, I think there's this tendency to forget like how little we knew during COVID, and certainly, Andy, there are comparisons between, say, Spanish flu in 1918, polio epidemic, things like that. Why do people forget the effectiveness of like communities coming together to combat these diseases and then push back against these under the norms of like, was this during COVID about personal liberty, or was it a thing about personal identity and saying I'm a Trump versus person or a Biden person? Is this about identity, or is it about personal liberties?
It's that. It's also about political trust. And when I have students read this stuff, they are just sort of in 2026 or whatever, shocked by how much trust people had in their government. They're trusting their local officials to do what's right. They're trusting their neighbors. In most of these communities, it was required by law to report if you were sick, because your neighbors needed to know about it. And so they trusted their neighbors to report it. They trusted the accuracy of the newspapers. Newspapers were publishing how many people were sick, where they lived, where the quarantines were, so you could stay away from those places. All this kind of stuff. And it requires a tremendous amount of trust in your leaders. And COVID hit at a time, and that time's still going on, of profound distrust. And distrust at lots of different levels. And that's, I think, where a lot of it came from. But yeah, it's identity markers. The person that I trust said this, and so I'm following this way, whether or not that person has any authority or any scientific bearing or whatever. So that's a lot of it. And it's frustrating. How do you regain that trust? But as you were starting to say, why don't we know about this stuff that happened? Part of it, we're victims of our own success. We had wiped out so many diseases. Most of us grew up without having to see epidemics in our communities. So the first time we have these quarantines and things since 1918 in 100 years, they feel really foreign. And it really like the government is stomping on us because we haven't seen it before. And part of it is a critique of history, social studies, our education. When we talk about the American Revolution, we don't talk about disease and combating disease. Generally speaking, I know when I took U.S. history in high school, we didn't spend any time on the 1918 flu epidemic. We didn't talk about what sort of ordinary Americans faced. It's not until college or graduate school that you read A Midwife's Tale and you read about medicine in these places and what men and women are doing to combat it. And I think that's part of it. It's so because it seems like our politicians are only concerned with laws and wars, and that's all that politicians should do because that's what we learn about in history classes, and we don't learn about community safety efforts that have always been going on. We don't learn about how politicians start to regulate trash collection in a city and really important public health things that were maybe controversial at their time that we've come to grips with, and I don't know how to incorporate that necessarily. There's so many things to cover in a history class, but that's part of where it's lost because people don't know these stories. Certainly I didn't. I rediscovered a lot in writing the book itself.
Yeah, I had never even considered disease history as even a thing. And so I was introduced to it by one of my professors at Wichita State, George Diener, who has written on diseases as well. I just love George to death. He's been on the pod. We did 12 Monkeys when he came on, which was a lot of fun. We want people to go out and read Contagion of Liberty, obviously. But what other books, Andy, do you like for people to go, hey, what's out there? Because we talked a little bit about Mosquito Empires, but there's obviously, I'm thinking about Lil Finn's work. Like, what else do you like out there? What's our reading list on this? Just stuff that pops in your head.
So I was introduced to, as an undergrad, it had just come out pretty recently, was Elizabeth Finn's Pax Americana.
Totally.
And that was so good. And it was eye-opening that there was this epidemic. It spread across the continent at the same time as the revolution. And that was part of what I resisted doing this project because I was like, Elizabeth Finn already did it and did it so well. So that was, people were saying, well, didn't Finn already do this?
Right.
And trying to find where mine was different. She ultimately has been a really helpful enthusiast for my project, even in places where I'm a little bit critical of hers. We do different things in the books. There's lots of room to talk more about disease and epidemic in the past, but hers was a big influence on me. Other people doing great work. One that I'm excited about is Elise Mitchell, and she, gosh, where is she now? She is at, I think, Swarthmore. Bounced around a couple of different places, but she's writing a book called Morbid Constitutions that's about the sort of transmission of African medical knowledge, and she's digging into the origins of Onesimus, how disease and information about protecting people spread from Africa into the Caribbean, and really interesting stuff on the Black Atlantic and disease. So I'm looking forward to when her book is coming out. But another one that comes to mind was Jim Downs' book about smallpox in the Civil War. And I remember when I was writing my introduction, I was kind of searching. I had a big pile of introductions of books that I liked, and Jim Downs' introduction. I'm blanking on the title of his book, but about how in the Civil War, how terrible smallpox was on the enslaved Black population, and it should adjust our numbers of how many people died in the Civil War because of how tragic this was eye-opening to me a little bit later. And I sort of consider the end of my book as like the early 1800s, and that's where Jim Downs, Catherine Oliverius, who writes about yellow fever in New Orleans, that's where some of these 19th century histories of disease take off. So there's a lot of good reading out there.
Well, let's talk about some more reading. Let's write a sequel now, Andy, to your book, right? Someone comes back and says, in 100 years from now, I want to revisit, Contagion of Liberty, and I want to revisit COVID, and I want to revisit.
We got it all wrong. We want to revisit.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Right. But like when someone comes back and says, in 100 years, I want to revisit all of these discussions over disease, and not just yourself, but like all of these other works that have been done. What do you think the conversations are going to be like a few decades from now?
I don't know. I mean, I think I've thought about that too. When people read my book, are they picking up and saying, well, this guy was obviously influenced by COVID, right? This was a COVID era book. It's a book on disease that's written there. And there has been a little bump in people who are interested in disease because of COVID, and the books that were sort of coming out even before have gotten more attention, right? And I hope that does have an impact over time, that people rediscover the importance of public health, its early roots and antecedents, that's there. But yeah, I think there's a lot of room to do local studies, community studies. There are places where disease strikes. I mean, I could throw a pin in a map, and I sort of did. If anybody reads the book, they'll think, why does he talk about one town after another? It's because you go to any local archive, town history meeting minutes, and they're all having conversations about what are we going to do about smallpox. The next town over did it this way. Let's try something new here. And the stories just bubble up. And so there's so many places to visit, and disease profiles that are coming out. So I think understanding how the expectations that early Americans had of their government, so long as we have a government that's rooted in the 18th century with this Constitution, and maybe it won't stick around forever. I don't know. Maybe we'll rewrite it by 100 years. But as long as it's rooted in the 18th century, kind of understanding how 18th century Americans and the demands they were making on their local, state, national government are still part of our own conversation, whether we like it or not. And there's a lot of room for more. So,
well, Andy, we spent all this time talking about the past. What comes in the future? What's next for you? You've written this amazing book. Are you working on another project, or what happens next?
I hope there's more amazing books. There are a couple of other kind of smallpox related articles and things that I've got cooking, but the next book project, I'm moving away from that disease, and I'm sort of excited to start talking about it. I've got a chapter or two written, and it's coming along. And it's a book about a riot in New York City called the Doctors' Riot in 1788. And this was a riot where ordinary New Yorkers, especially Black New Yorkers, were rioting against medical students in New York City who had been digging up bodies for dissection, digging up bodies from cemeteries to take them to the hospital to practice anatomy and practice dissecting on these bodies. And so this was rumored and discussed. There's a riot in April 1788 in New York. New York's the capital of the United States at this point. Hamilton is there. John Jay's there. They're writing the Federalist Papers. It's before the Constitution has taken off. And in Hamilton, the musical, where it says John Jay got sick after writing however many, he didn't get sick. He got hit with a rock in the doctors' riot. Hamilton and Jay were out there armed against these rioters who were going after doctors. And the authorities in New York, nobody knew who fired the shots, but they fired on protesters in New York City. At least 3 people were killed by the Federalists, essentially by Jay and Hamilton and Baron Steuben and some military figures who were there. It stops the riot. So my book's going to be kind of a microhistory of this event, talking about what the medical students were up to, medical education in New York, the rioters themselves, what they're angry about, where they're coming from, what Hamilton and Jay were up to. They try to suppress this history. It's not a good look for them that they're shooting at protesters in the streets of New York City. And then some of the aftermath, what some of the new rules that come about for dissecting bodies and where they should come from. It's some of the first acts of Congress are acts to send criminals to doctors so that they don't have to dig up bodies out of graves anymore. So that kind of stuff, cool stuff, violence, medicine, New York City, the politics of a new nation coming together. You won't see it for a couple of years, but that's what's happening.
Dude, that is really exciting. If that comes out anything like your current book, like I'm all in. But we're gonna have to have you back on well before then. We're gonna have to have you pick a film and come in. We'll talk about movies at some point in time or something like that. Because Andy, this conversation was so much fun. I got up giddy this morning to talk to you after reading your work. I was like, oh man, this is such a cool story to talk about, especially on the eve of our 250th anniversary. Hopefully people will say, wait a second, we need to be talking about disease history throughout the American narrative and maybe throughout the human experience, because you put these pieces together so well. And sitting here listening to you talk to me, it's such a natural conversation that you have. Man, this has been awesome, man. Thank you so very much for taking the time.
It's been super fun, and thanks for the invite. I would love to come back. I'd love to do a movie discussion. There are a few disease movies out there. Whatever. Happy to do it.
And that's a wrap here at Reckoning with Jason Herbert. Thank you so very much to our guest, Andrew Wehrman. Andy, that was amazing. Dude, you are such a storyteller. Thank you so much for coming on. Thank you to our producer, Fletcher Powell, for making this show happen. And most of all, thank you to all of you for sharing this podcast, for coming back. If you like the pod, make sure you subscribe to it wherever it is that you listen. If you really like the pod, please go ahead and make sure you leave a review, comments, all of that stuff to help us grow the pod, and share this podcast on social media with your friends and help us keep growing Reckoning with Jason Herbert. We've got some really amazing podcasts, including a superstar coming for you this Thursday. So make sure you're subscribed. We'll talk to you later. Ciao for now. Bye.